Hello and welcome to Every Woman with me, Anna Umbima. This week, a step back in time with Jewish women in Poland 100 years ago. And 20th century woman, Botswana's first female High Court judge from humble beginnings.
You have to remember that we did our law degree in Swaziland and Edinburgh. So to get there, we had to ride a bus, okay? Here I am out of, high school, never really been out of my village. And suddenly you have to get a passport. I had never had a passport before, and you have to go to another country.
Unity Dow, the student destined for the top. Also on the programme, dancing in the temple.
The whole issue was bhakti, which is sweet eroticism really, if you want it in a nutshell, that you can also worship God through devotion, which is of an erotic mode.
How an ancient and sometimes maligned Indian art form is enjoying a revival. And do you speak English, French, Russian and German? An interpreter explains their head for languages. Canadian Lillian Nattell sat down to write her first novel a few years ago, she thought she'd never find a publisher. Set at the end of the last century, she wondered who'd be interested in reading about the lives of a group of women living in a shtetl, or Jewish village, in pre-war eastern Poland. But she couldn't be further wrong. The River Midnight was almost immediately taken up by an agent and publisher. It's just come out in Britain and will shortly be published around the world. It centres on the life of Misha, the local midwife, whose independence is envied by the local women, many of whom, too, have their own dreams and desires. So what inspired Lillian to write about these women?
I began The River Midnight with a vision of a woman who was large, independent, and especially earthy. And I thought it would be interesting to write about a woman with that character in a Jewish village in eastern Poland 100 years ago, because that was an environment that was so restrictive in terms of women's roles. And yet, on the other hand, women who lived in these Jewish villages, shtetls, were worldly in a way that we don't think of women 100 years ago being, because these were working women. These were women who had to work in the marketplace. These were women who were selling goods or who were doing small crafts like knitting. And if their husbands were studying, as some men did, then it would be the women who were supporting their husbands while they studied religious texts. And if their men were working men, then they needed two incomes to live. Times were very hard, and women were expected to work as well as take care of their children.
Now, how did you find out about this society? Because I know your parents were originally Jewish immigrants from Poland. Mm-hmm. Was it something that was talked about in your family as you grew up?
Very much so. They certainly talked about it, and I was also very interested in stories, Jewish stories from before the war, and I read a lot, and so that just seeped into me. And my grandmother and my mother's view of what women did in terms of their stories, of their mothers, very much reflected that sort of independence and strength that existed 100 years ago.
Now we have here a group of women who are with bonds of friendship and frictions as well. And what the essential woman is Misha, who is often the subject of gossip. Now in this extract you touch upon how other women viewed her independence.
Misha swore that she would never marry, but just the same she did. Hanna-Leah had thought that marriage would straighten Misha out. A wife has to cover her head and know what it means to work. But Misha's husband had divorced her, and instead of moving away, she had grown her hair long again. It blew about in the wind like a living thing, and Misha was a wilde Haie, a wild animal still. "And you, Misha, when are you going under the wedding canopy again?" the women asked. "Never. There isn't a man who could tempt me."
It seems that life as a single woman in this kind of community must have been very difficult.
Yes, it was. And that was the sense in which women's lives were restrictive, because a woman was expected to be married, and to be married very young, and to have children. And a woman who was not married and didn't have children was an object of suspicion. Men wondered about her, and women were both drawn towards her, perhaps envious of her, perhaps suspicious of her as a single woman who might be overly sexual. And what did that mean for them? Did that mean that their husbands might be the target of her sexual desires? Or did that mean that she was doing something perhaps that they wished they could but didn't? She didn't face the risks of childbearing that they did. And particularly for Misha, who is a midwife, it's ironic that she's the one who is so strong and present for the women when they're in danger. And so in some ways they're jealous of her, some of them, and for others, she is the woman they wished that they could be.
She does come through as a very strong character. Now, no, it strikes me that you're talking about women living in the 1890s in this small Jewish village, but actually it has a resonance for women living in the 1990s. Were you trying to draw, and in other ways as well, trying to draw similarities between that period and the period that we're living in now?
Yes, I was, because the 1890s was a time when people had a great sense of change, just as they have a great sense of change today. Women then, just as now, had sexual desires, had hopes and aspirations that sometimes they were able to fulfill and other times weren't. And women had to rely on women's friendships then, just as they do today at many points in their lives.
And there's another character that shows this sexuality. She's an older woman, Alta Fruma, and she's secretly drawn to Chaim, who is a young man. He's a lowly water carrier.
Let me ask you a question, Chaim. Alta Fruma smiled, the tip of her tongue touching her lips. She would ask him how he got his pig, a Jew with a pig. And suddenly she wanted to know something else, something entirely different. She had never seen a man naked, and she wanted to see. Before she died, she would like to see it all. Such thoughts, not sensible at all. And Chaim was looking at her, waiting for the question that she couldn't ask.
But sexuality in older women, it's generally not acknowledged. I mean, it wasn't acknowledged in the 1890s, but it's not acknowledged often in novels these days, is it?
No, and that's why when I was writing The River Midnight, I very much wanted to write about the sexuality of an older woman, because I don't want, as a woman of my age, to feel that 20 or 25 years from now, I'm going to be sexless. And I certainly know from my great aunt, who is over 80, that her sex life is still vibrant and quite alive in a way that I would be quite happy to have it right now. So that was something I wanted to be able to read in other books. And so when I was writing The River Midnight, I wrote about it, and I tell you, I enjoyed writing that part more than any other part of the book.
Now, you're not an older woman in that kind of sense. You're not over 60. But
No, certainly not.
But I know that you do work with women. You do creative writing courses with women who are in their 60s, and some of them in their 80s. Are they able to be frank about their feelings?
Yes, they are, and that was something that I found very interesting, because these are women who grew up in a time when people didn't talk about sex. But now that they're older, they feel free to do that, and they are very frank. I blush sometimes at the jokes that they tell.
Is it something that you would encourage women to do, even whatever age, to express themselves through writing?
Very much so. Every woman has a unique voice that nobody else can replicate. And when a woman starts to write, she just blossoms in her self-expression.
I was speaking to Lillian Natal. In India, up until the Second World War, women used to dance in the temple to honour the gods. Their dance was known as Devadasi, or simply temple dancing. But because it seemed erotic, the British disapproved of it and finally banned the dance in 1947. Over the past few years, however, this solo female dance form has seen something of a revival, as Claire Jenkins discovered.
I'm at the India International Centre in New Delhi, and I'm watching a demonstration of Devadasi dancing by Swapna Sundari, a leading classical dancer who is helping to revive the dance form. She was taught it by two elderly ex-Devadasi dancers whom she found living in extreme poverty.
Actually, the this word became an Anglo-Indian term. Deva means God and Dasi means a devotee or servant in quotes, someone who serves the god.
Amrit Srinivasan is a social anthropologist. She's written a book about the Devadasis, whose dance was first mentioned in the 8th century.
1, it's solo. Only the woman dances. 2, it's in the form where she, through her dance, is also doing theatre or drama, because it's not just pure dance or just rhythm. There is poetry too, a lyric. She will interpret the lyric not through singing, but through miming. And the lyric is usually to the god or the hero or the lover, so that the audience understands that gesture language through conventional hand, eye, neck, all parts of the body gestures.
Traditionally, the Devadasi was a beautiful young girl who was dedicated to the temple gods. She learnt dance, music and mythology, and every day she would go through the daily ritual of worship, from waking the gods up to singing them to sleep.
She was dedicated at a young age. It went hand in hand with her training for the dance, which again has to be at a young age. Like the ballet or like any classical form, if you learn too late, you're not good at it. Here the whole issue was bhakti, which is more, sweet eroticism really, if you want it in a nutshell, that you can also worship God through devotion, which is of an erotic mode.
First part of it says, the cock has begun to crow as the moonlight fades away. The lotuses are beginning to bloom as fragrant breezes usher in the early morning. Arise, O Lord.
They were rich because, one, they were in control of land. When I interviewed the Devadasis, they had made a lot of money through selling the land, through private property rights, new rights that had come in. So they had land which was given by the temple, the house side, and they had land given by their admirers. There was cash, there was jewelry and clothing. So those who were well known, and obviously there were few, were really independent. They didn't need to rely on a husband.
Because the dancers were not married, and because their dance was erotic, the Victorian British decided they were immoral. Gradually, as they moved out of the temple to dance in private houses and British army camps, they acquired a bad reputation. Dancer Swapna Sundari takes up the story.
The way the temples are funded is that most of the temples fall into zamindaris. Zamindari means a land holding. Zamindars were landlords. And the zamindars actually employed the staff in the temple and maintained the staff. The Devadasi was a part of the staff. She was paid for her services. Naturally, there was this young, beautiful woman. Perhaps it was felt that the people who have immediate right over her were the priest and the landlord. That gave way to a whole set of evil patterns where the Devadasi gradually acquired the reputation of being a kind of a common prostitute.
As a result, they were eventually banned from dancing, and they suffered great hardship before Swapna Sundari and other dancers came along.
They have nothing. They're very poor. And some of them have resorted to singing some bhajans. You know, these are sort of hymns, devotional hymns, at the temple doorstep when there is some singing called for, and if someone feels like contributing some money, they're able to make a little bit, but not very much. They live very, very Spartan lives. Most of them are ailing, and they're all very old. So far as Devadasis themselves are concerned, they don't wish to restore their connections with the temple dances. And those people, that's their offspring, they would like to join, and they have, many of them already joined mainstream society.
Sonal Mansingh is another dancer involved in the revival of Devadasi dancing. I visited her at home in New Delhi when she was rehearsing a group of young dancers.
Devdasi dancing was, I think, also very internalized, meaning that, when you're not dancing for an assembly of 3,000 or 1,000 people, you're dancing for a limited audience of priests and devotees, and then you're not dancing to them, you're dancing in front of the God. For example, when I dance in temples today, the crowds of devotees are behind me. I'm in front of God. It is because I want to offer my art to the God. And nobody stops me, because after all it's like people offering flowers or people offering incense. I offer my dance. But that is why I say that we are the modern Devadasis. There are many dancers, wonderful dancers, but unless you have that intensity or that kind of emotion or that kind of devotion or that look in your eye, you don't become a Devadasi.
The ancient art of Devadasi. You're listening to Every Woman on the BBC World Service with me, Anna Umbima. When Unity Dow was growing up in rural Botswana, she had 3 ambitions: to ride a horse, play a guitar and fly a plane. She hasn't managed any of those yet, but instead she's made history. She's become her country's first female High Court judge. When she did her law degree, she was one of only 2 women in her year. Having joined the very masculine world of the law profession, she found there were many women who needed her legal help, but who just couldn't afford to pay commercial rates. Always rather unconventional, no one was more surprised than this 39-year-old mother of 3 when she was asked to become a High Court judge.
When I was first approached last year, I said, you can't be serious. I mean, me, a judge. I mean, I guess I've worked out of it, the establishment for so long. I expected that to continue. So at first I said, you must have made a mistake. You didn't really want your permit, did you now? Then I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and I thought, yeah, I think I want to do this, I don't regret the decision at all, but it definitely is crazy, I don't know how to explain it, the feeling and the responsibility, of the job, I guess, another thing that is just overwhelming for me. That one person, can sit in judgment of others and hopefully come up with, some wisdom. I don't know if I'm that wise, In the past year, the judges have been, older, male and white. Okay, so about 5 years ago, they started to be, still old, but both white and black. So I'm female, young, and black. It's like, I don't represent the image of a judge, to many people. And then, when I first came here, I parked my car, and people came and saluted me and opened my doors, and I said, oh my God, they can't do this to me. Really, shocked me. I didn't know how to deal with this. Took my bags out of the car. But I realized also, as far as carrying your bags, it's been older men. They needed that help. I don't need that help. I don't need somebody to carry my bag, It's kind of strange. You came in here and the first thing, of course, was to be measured for my robes, And the whole thing is pants and a jacket and a robe, And, of course, they were not too sure whether I should have pants. So I didn't get the trousers, and so I didn't get the special issue. I do want the jacket though, so I still got something.
So that was a fairly simple problem to solve. But in her conversation with Will Ross, Unity Dow revealed that in her law practice, she was often frustrated at being unable to help the many women who needed it. So she set up a legal aid group, Metletsile. Much of the group's work has been giving advice to women in dispute over property or who gets child custody when relationships break down. But women rarely seek help for fear of the costs involved, both financial and emotional.
Almost invariably, when you look at those relationships, the females are younger, they are less economically stable, and therefore the relationship has never really been an equal one. And therefore it's much more difficult to challenge, once the relationship is over. And the other thing is not always, but very often people will say, I'm afraid of witchcraft. Maybe if I go against him, then he's going to bewitch my child. So some people would even say, look, I'd rather not have support than, fight this. Or sometimes the feeling that fighting over a child actually puts some kind of negative vibes. I mean, it's kind of bad omen. So I'd rather not fight him because then, it could affect the health of my child, the happiness of my child. So I won't do it.
As a result, there are 2 areas of law which she'd like to see reformed.
We need a comprehensive law on how to deal with, violence within the family in a way that does not place the responsibility on the battered to act. For example, a battered woman within a family is unlikely to act on their own unless with assistance with the system. So very often the police will say, but she didn't want to press charges. Of course she didn't want to press charges. Are you kidding?
She get battered again.
Yes. So in a way, as long as you place the responsibility for her to act on her, but we don't create a system that is sympathetic and responsive to her needs, then, there's nothing. So I really would like to see a more comprehensive law on that. The other issue, really relates to children and children's rights and has to do with divorcing parents. That I would like to see a law that demands representation at the cost of the state, at the expense of the state for the children. Because I see, as a judge, I see more now, in this position as a judge, that I see they just treat it as part of the goods. You see, the mother takes the children and the bed, the father takes the cow and, the car. So I don't think that's right. As a judge, I often have to step in and be that advocate, and I don't think that should be my role. I think there should be a third person who actually can deal with those issues.
Do you think when a woman goes into the court on trial, she's relieved to see Unity Dow?
It depends on the issue. Some people think, will I be biased in favor of women? And I always say I'll be biased in favor of the Constitution and equal rights for everybody. I'm sure a woman who, feels that the kind of problem she has to do with her position as a woman. It has to do either with violence, with child support, with property issues. Then I think she'll be happy to see me there because she'll say, there's one judge who probably knows what she's doing.
And she quite clearly does. Unity Dow was talking to Will Ross. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll mark the International Day of Action Against Violence Towards Women here on Every Woman. Now, many of us speak more than one language, but it's something of a skill to communicate fluently in a variety of different languages simultaneously. Barbara Chisholm is such a polyglot. It's her job. Barbara was born in the German city of Essen and originally hoped to work as a musician, but a climbing accident forced her to give up playing the flute, and she changed to language studies, eventually moving to Berlin, where she now works as a freelance conference interpreter. She finds that many people think that her job is glamorous, characterised by jet-setting and meeting foreign dignitaries. So in this week's diary, she's decided to set the record straight.
Freelance conference interpreter? Many people have no idea what it means, and it's hard to explain. It's always changing. Most of us have seen television pictures of heads of state surrounded by interpreters after a summit conference. This high-profile work is usually done by staffers, employed full-time by the governments concerned. I'm bilingual in English and German. I also work from Russian, so I've been lucky enough to work for political leaders like Chancellor Kohl, President Gorbachev and John Major. However, these assignments are a fraction of my work, which is just as likely to cover pipe laying, reinforced plastics, or a film festival. Did you know you can interpret for hours without meeting the speaker? Usually you're stuck in a tiny soundproof box called a booth, peering at speakers through glass windows and linked by radio. You receive the speaker's words through headphones, and in simultaneous interpretation, you're talking to an audience, hearing you through their earphones. It demands intense concentration and is very tiring, working in relays with a colleague taking over every 30 minutes or so. And while conference delegates may be comfortable, many of us think booth designers want us to freeze or fry. Friends are often surprised to learn how much you earn per day. However, you might only work 6 days a month, and technical conferences can demand days of unpaid preparation. Unless I really understand, I can't interpret. Native English speakers British, American, Australian, for example, are relatively easy to interpret, as are Germans and Austrians, though the Swiss can be a little more difficult. It doesn't matter how quickly they talk. I really can talk that fast, and clearly too. Whether the audience takes it in is a different matter, but the speaker's responsible for pace, not me. The real problem comes with non-native speakers who think they speak good English or German, but don't. But if it doesn't make sense, then you just do the best you can, read between the lines, and try to summarize what you think the speaker means. You can't butt in. He or she may have an important message. In an increasingly tight economic environment, a conference organizer might have told him English, German, or shut up. We can't afford your language. Mistakes? Yes, everyone makes them occasionally. I still blush over one of my first assignments. There are two words, similar in English and German. Instead of referring to fruitful cooperation, I spoke of frightful cooperation. In general, a freelance can't afford to be wrong. A freelance who makes mistakes doesn't get the next assignment. And if you did get it wrong, it'd be pretty clear, because conference speakers would start talking at cross purposes. Really, it's like an exam every time. And I've had a non-native speaker use a seriously bad obscenity, which he clearly didn't understand. I did. Hesitated, stumbled, recovered, and used a far more moderate term. Not forgetting the time I was introduced as the minister's wife, rather than the interpreter. And then there are words one would rather avoid. My pet hate is anaesthetist. Sometimes I'm tempted to cheat and use an Americanism, anesthesiologist. But I'm just as likely to stumble on that. Anaesthetist. Well, I got it out that time, but you see what I mean. If the job sounds glamorous, with first-class hotels and business flights, it can be, but usually isn't. And there are days one would rather forget. I'd been hired for a meeting on the Swedish island of Gotland. Things went wrong as soon as I arrived at Berlin's Tegel airport around midday. Scheduled to fly via Stockholm, I'd been ready to settle down with a book when I saw flight cancelled. The airline flew us to Hamburg, northern Germany, promising a connection to Stockholm. The Hamburg flight was late. The Stockholm one postponed. We finally reached the Swedish capital after midnight. The airline put us up, but in another city. And to top it all, my luggage was nowhere to be found. Work started at 9:30. I arrived, travel-stained and weary, at 8:45, without suitcase, my clothes, or makeup. I was leaving the hotel when the airline finally delivered the case. Whew. By 9:30 I was working and went on until nearly midnight. Stimulating, yes. Interesting, yes. But if I was describing the work of a conference interpreter, I don't think I'd choose the word glamorous.
And I think I'm inclined to agree. Barbara Chisholm's diary. And we'd love to hear from you if you'd like to write a diary about something that's happened in your life. You'll hear the address in a moment. But that's it from me for today. Next week, the only British woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, the scientist and peace campaigner, Dorothy Hodgkin. But until then, from me and the rest of the team, goodbye.
Every Woman was presented by Anna Umbina, and if you'd like to get in touch with the programme, you can write to Every Woman at BBC World Service, Bush House, London, or email us on everywoman@bbc.co.uk. In 5 minutes, we'll take a look back over the past week's financial developments in World Business Review. Then at 9:15 GMT, we've our omnibus edition of Westway. First, though, it's time for a news bulletin. This is London.